Hello, everyone.
Hi, Jonathan.
All right. Who's on here with me? Is that Ruby?
Yes, how are you?
Awesome. I'm okay. Are we the only ones on?
There's an Alexandra Nelson Tomlinson,
Okay.
and I guess we're waiting for other folks to join.
Cool. Cool. Well, thanks for setting this up as always.
You're welcome. Did you have any trouble logging in?
No, I just had to register for an account, so it was pretty straightforward once that happened.
Okay. I think I just sent out some instructions to everyone. Yeah, there's a sign-in sheet.
Okay.
There's a link in the chat box. I just sent it out on email as well with some further instructions.
Okay. Okay.
And yeah.
Cool.
If you want to, oh, yeah, Hanley will be leading it, but no. All right. Do you have any questions right now?
No, I'm great. So feel free to get back to whatever you need to do to support the meeting, and I'm looking forward to being part of it.
Okay. All righty.
Good morning.
Morning, Lloyd.
Hey, I can be heard. That's a good thing. How you doing, Jonathan?
Pretty good. It's a beautiful day, and yeah, just happy to be with folks here. So,
Yes, as we can be.
how about you? You doing okay?
Doing all right. Doing all right. Making the best of things. Doing a lot of walking. Doing some gardening. Plugging away. What about you?
Yeah, mostly house projects and working from home. So there
Yep.
never seems to be a shortage of things that I could do around the house.
Right. Now, where's my? Let's see. I've got audio. There we are. Ruby, where's Ruby? Ruby's not showing her video.
Hi, Lloyd.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm actually going to ask everyone, once we get some more people in, to cut off their videos because that takes up some of the bandwidth.
Gotcha.
And so,
Good to see Drew, though, for a moment there, at least. Hey,
Good morning. How y'all doing?
good, thanks.
Hi, Lloyd.
Hi, Ebony. How are ya? You guys still working to finish the school year?
Still working to finish the school year.
Well, hopefully the children are still learning.
Yes, they are.
Learning some things about the 21st century world. Of course, as I read recently, pandemics are nothing new.
Just living through it. Just
Living through it. That's right. Humanity has them every so often.
Mhm.
Hi, Alma.
Hey, Lloyd. How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you doing?
Doing well today.
We're appreciating how awesome you are. It's a nice screenshot.
Thank you.
I need to found yesterday, although I haven't gotten there. There's somewhere where one can choose your background. I'm looking for that again.
Yes, you can. You can change it and have some backdrops, and you can be in the ocean. You can be at the
Right,
beach.
right. My video doesn't want to stop now. There we are. We're still waiting on Hanalei as well. Ruby, are we planning to record this session?
It is recording now.
It is recording now. All right.
I sent an email to everyone letting them know that that it would be recorded.
Very good. Hopefully you can edit out this introductory time. We're filling
I will.
time.
I most certainly will.
Welcome, Alexandra, I'm sorry.
Hey, Lloyd.
How's it going?
Pretty good, pretty good. I've lost track of time and days. So I woke up this morning and for the first 15 minutes, I thought it was Wednesday. So that's where I'm at in my life.
Okay, so you lost a day somewhere.
Yeah, apparently.
One day closer to the weekend, Angela Warren has joined us. Alexander Putzman has joined us. Welcome, Alexander, Angela. All these A names. Ruby, do you have a sense for how many people we're expecting or who has registered?
I know we have 13. And I'm waiting for, wait, where's my calendar? I had 9 to accept, so.
Okay. We're assuming Hanalei is still in the process of joining. I think she's got the first session. As we wait, do you want to review the agenda, Ruby?
Mm-hmm. What was that?
Say, would you want to review the agenda as we're waiting for the last people to join us, and especially for Hanalei to join us?
There we go.
Very good. This may not take that long, but better to have, everybody likes to get out early of anything, I think. And we'll see if we can get that accomplished. But this is obviously the first time we've done this in a virtual format. And it may take a little while. It's taking us a little while to get everybody on the webinar, on the orientation session virtually. So we'll have a break. We'll have 2 breaks between the section 1 and 2 and 3. And we'll see how it goes. Certainly people are welcome to use the chat box throughout the session. I believe Ruby will be monitoring the chat box. Is that one of the things you'll be doing in the background, Ruby?
I will.
Okay, so that if there are particular questions that come up throughout the session, feel free to write them in the chat box, and as appropriate, we'll get to them throughout the time. We do have question time built into the agenda as well.
Lloyd, what do you see on my screen?
I am seeing the agenda for the Durham Continuum of Care Orientation, Agenda 5720.
Is there anything like a grayed out box on there?
Responsibilities of CoC members is highlighted in gray, but there's no grayed out box on my, other than that. What are you seeing?
I'm just making sure that I can share my screen while I'm doing other things.
Okay. Thanks everyone for your patience as we get ourselves oriented to this new technology. Ruby has done a lot of work with getting us connected to Zoom and increasing our security with Zoom. I noticed that today. You did that work, right, Ruby?
Yep, that's why we're having problems now.
Well, with increased security, it takes a bit longer for people to get logged in. Have we heard from Hanalei at all this morning, Ruby?
She's on. I'm working to get her in.
Gotcha.
Hi everyone, can y'all hear me?
Now we can hear you, Hanalei. Good morning.
Good morning. I apologize. Was having some difficulty with the new process. Just trying to figure out how to get in and everything. So apologize.
Yep. Safety and security.
I realize I don't have, got audio, but I don't have my earbuds working yet. So work on that.
All right. So I think, Ruby, are we good to go ahead and get started? Were y'all just waiting on me?
I was waiting on some other folks to join. I know there were some providers that you wanted to be in. I know I had 9 who said that they would come.
I just got in, Hanalei. I was having difficulty also.
Learning the new process.
So while we're waiting to get started, everyone, just a couple of things for logistics. There is a sign-in form. The link is in the chat box. I also emailed everyone the link as well. Please complete it by 3 p.m. It will close. Also, if you are on the web, you can type your questions into the chat box. If you are on the phone, you can dial *6 to mute and unmute yourself. If you need to ask a question and you're on the phone, dial *9 to raise your hand or ask a question. We're also going to ask everyone to turn off their video so we can preserve bandwidth on the call. And if you have any questions and you get kicked out or it drops your call or whatever, please text me. I emailed everyone my cell phone number so you can contact me when we're in the middle of the presentation. Yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know.
Maybe should we just go ahead and get started?
Sure. You want me to go ahead and start up your presentation?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Ruby, Jonathan has mentioned he didn't see the registration link in the chat box. You might re-enter that.
It's all the way at the top.
Okay.
Analea, your cross-cutting policies, right?
I have to look back at the agenda.
Ruby, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Actually, I have a number of questions. One is that my light is flashing that this is being recorded. That surprises me. Secondly, I don't see that link in the chat box at all. And thirdly, if I turn my video off, I can't see the presentation.
The presentation isn't up yet. I will recopy the link again for everyone. So it should be there now.
Oh, yes, I see it. Thank you.
And if you turn off your video, I haven't started sharing the presentation yet.
Ruby, yeah, I think that's just what I called the presentation. That should be right.
Okay, gotcha.
All right. Well, now that we are finally up and running, good morning, everyone. Should we do a round of introductions? Have we done that, just to know who's here?
We haven't.
All right, so maybe we can just start by doing some introductions. My name is Hanalea Hoberman. I work for the City of Durham Community Development Department on the homelessness team. Maybe Ruby, since you're sharing your screen, I think you're the one who can still see everyone. Do you want to call folks out to introduce themselves?
Let me see how this works. I'll introduce myself. Ruby Holmes with Community Development Coordinator for the Homeless Services Team. Lloyd.
Good morning, Lloyd Schmeidler, also with Community Development Department, City of Durham, working on CoC lead agency activities and work.
Okay. Carolyn.
Carolyn Schultz with Open Table Ministry.
Alex.
Hey, Alex Cross, Executive Director of Life Skills Foundation. We do housing and wraparound supports for homeless young adults.
Alexandra.
Hello, Alexandra Nelson Tomlinson, and I'm with Open Table Ministry.
Alma Davis.
Good morning, or almost afternoon. It's Alma Davis with Durham Crisis Response Center.
Drew Pridgeon.
Good morning. I'm Drew Pridgeon with TROSA. I'm the Government Programs Administrator here.
Angela Warren.
Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here. My name is Angela, and I work at TROSA. I am Drew's alternate, and I'm the intake manager here.
All right. Ebony.
Good morning, Ebony Thomas, Durham Public Schools. I am McKinney-Vento Coordinator for Durham Public Schools.
Glenn Silver.
Good morning, I'm Glenn Silver. I'm a consultant for ICNA Relief Naveen Allen is the coordinator for the state of North Carolina. We provide a lot of supportive services, hunger relief, food programs, life skills, entrepreneurship classes, and they're just getting involved in a lot of the things. And I advise them to become a member of the continuum of care so they can know what other services are being offered and don't duplicate effort and can fill in some gaps. I also used to oversee housing and homelessness for the Division of Mental Health. And so I'm glad to be here, and I will be advising them on the best way for any new organization to get to know the lay of the land is to become a part of the continuum of care.
Okay. Thank you. Shaisha.
Good morning, I'm Shaisha Bell with Life Skills Foundation. I'm the housing director there.
Okay, Jonathan.
Good morning, I'm Jonathan Kroon with Durham County Veterans Services and the current chair of the Homeless Services Advisory Committee.
Tim Wallen.
Good morning, I'm Tim Willian. I'm the program director for Step Up Durham. We work with unemployed and underemployed adults to obtain and maintain employment and build financial stability.
And there's someone on the phone, a 640 number.
I'm assuming that's me. Is Sharita McCullers?
Hi, Sharita.
All right, social worker with the Lincoln Community Health Center Healthcare for the Homeless Clinic. I serve as the policy and planning chair for our subcommittee of the Homeless Services Advisory Committee, and I also sit on the Homeless Services Advisory Committee.
Alrighty, that's everyone.
Sorry, had to unmute myself. It looks like, all right, yeah, that gray box moved. All right, so we're gonna start by just giving an overview of the governance of the CoC. Ruby, if you could go to the next slide. All right, so some history here. And Ruby, it does look like there's a gray box just kind of in the middle. There you go. All right. So the
back.
Yeah, it's back. Oh well, we'll just make it work. So the current continuum of care, which is the regional body that addresses homelessness in Durham, is made up of Durham City and Durham County and was formed in 2012 upon the signing of an interlocal agreement between the city and county governments that they would both be in a continuum of care together. It laid out the cities and counties' responsibilities as they pertain to homelessness and created the expectation that the city's community development department that Lloyd, Ruby, and I all work for would serve as the lead agency to provide staffing to the homeless system. It established the Homeless Services Advisory Committee as in a dual role. So our board, our CoC board is unique in that it is the board of the CoC in its governing role, but it also serves as the primary advisory body to the city and the county on issues related to homelessness. So it does serve in that dual capacity. Next slide. So the interlocal as it stands now is very detailed in laying out the structure of the Homeless Services Advisory Committee. And this is pretty unusual. Traditionally, a continuum of care governance charter would set those standards, but currently in Durham, that is set by the interlocal. So it lays out the structure of the Homeless Services Advisory Committee, who's on it, who gets appointed by who. It lays out how long our terms are for, the responsibilities of members, and standards such as conflict of interest policies and It lays out who our officers are, and that officer structure establishes the executive committee. It creates standards for record keeping, and also even says what our meeting schedule is. So it's quite detailed, and you know, there has been some conversation about potentially trying to update that interlocal to give the CoC more autonomy. But of course, with everything going on with COVID, that process has slowed down a bit, but eventually, hopefully we do hope to move some of this to the governance charter to give the CoC more autonomy. Next slide. So as I mentioned, CoCs have to have a governance charter, and in Durham, the governance charter is a bit unusual in that it's subject to this interlocal, but we do still have one. The requirement to have a governance charter over your CoC was established in the 2012 CoC program interim rule. So the governance charter is supposed to set the structure of the continuum of care. It usually clarifies who the CoC lead agency is, who the collaborative applicant is. So that distinction there. In Durham, community development serves both as the lead agency and the collaborative applicant, but those roles actually can be separate. So as I mentioned, the lead agency provides that primary staffing to the homeless system. The collaborative applicant's role is to submit the collaborative application for the CoC grant on an annual basis. And so in Durham, we provide that dual role, but there isn't actually an opportunity to split those, and that some CoCs do that. And then it also would usually lay out who the HMIS lead agency is. Of course, in Durham, that's the North Carolina Coalition to End Homelessness. It would usually set up the structure of the CoC governance, including the board and its officers. In Durham, that's done by the interlocal currently. And then it also ensures that the CoC covers all of its responsibilities. There are a number of responsibilities of the CoC laid out in that CoC program interim rule. And so our governance charter has to make sure that we are fulfilling all of those responsibilities as a continuum. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we are in the process, which a slowed down process, but we are still in it, of trying to look at improving the capacity of the continuum of care through restructuring. And so the first stage of that restructuring was completed in October 2019 when the CoC approved a new governance charter. And that new governance charter laid out, you know, new committee roles and tried to do more delegation of responsibility so that not so much would have to all happen in the full HSAC meetings. The next stage is the revision of the interlocal agreement. And as I mentioned, there's just only so many changes that we can make only addressing the governance charter because the interlocal is so specific. It is the executive committee's role to lead that work. And they were working with us on that, but unfortunately we have had to put a pause on that work due to COVID, but we do hope to pick that back up soon. And then once the new interlocal is approved, we'll have to go back and do a second round of revisions to the governance charter to address the things that the interlocal previously addressed. So that's where we are in the phasing of changes for the CoC structure. Next slide. Next slide. All right, so this is an overview of a map of how we see the CoC governance working currently. I do want to say that this is our interpretation. So by no means is it hard and fast. This is 100% how it works. But we did want to give at least a visual that can help, because we know that for some folks it's very confusing. You know, wait, there's a lead agency, there's the C, there's the HSAC, there's all of these different folks, and who says what and who's overseeing what. So we wanted to provide this review of how it should work. So the HSAC is, for the continuum of care, is the lead governing body. So they're at the top here. And of course, they have a number of committees per the new governance charter. So there's an executive committee that is in charge of really the structure and the processes of the HSAC and of the CoC. That's really their role. And then there's the Performance Management Committee that looks at how our policies are being implemented and how we're performing, how our programs are performing. And then there's the Policy and Planning Committee that looks at setting policies for the continuum of care related to how services are provided and looking at how our overall system is performing. Then below the HSAC directs the CoC lead agency, and of course that currently is us, but technically, you know, the CoC could decide if they want to have a different lead agency. You know, as I said, the interlocal does lay this out, but the CoC is intended to be an autonomous body, so it does have that ability to change their lead agency if they want. And then there's also an HMIS lead agency, and as you can see, those two entities serve hand in hand as they look over services and data. And then in Durham, we have this unique role of the Coordinated Entry Administrator fulfilled by the North Carolina Coalition to End Homelessness. And they, of course, have a direct relationship. The HSAC directs the Coordinated Entry Administrator in what policies to implement, but then also the City of Durham holds that contract with NCCH for that role. So there is sort of this unique and dual role in that they are accountable both to the city and to the HSAC. And then, of course, everyone is accountable to the continuum of care membership. And that, you know, that is sort of at the bottom, but it's also at the top because the continuum of care membership are the ones who approve the governance charter, of course. But the continuum of care membership has a number of opportunities to be engaged. One opportunity is to create CoC work groups. Anyone in the CoC can create a work group, and we'll post that information on the CoC's webpage so that anyone can join, and you get to report back about your work at the full CoC meetings that we have at least twice a year. So that's something to think about if you have a project that you're really passionate about or a subpopulation you want to focus on. And then there's also the Ombudsman panel that is directly appointed by the CoC membership in order to address grievances related to the CoC.
Annalee, if I could add, this is Lloyd. It's really important, I think, in terms of understanding the CoC to see the CoC lead agency and the HMIS lead agency as well as the coordinated entry administrator roles as really serving the needs of the broader continuum. So it's not in the diagram, it's not that we are liaisons between the HSAC and the continuum of care membership as much as just linking and serving the needs of the HSAC as well as the membership and trying to ensure that the CoC fulfills its responsibilities and is a well-functioning body that is working together to prevent and end homelessness in our community. And that's something I think all need to remind ourselves of and keep in mind as we work through issues around governance and COVID-19 and everything else, is that what our overall purpose is. Thanks.
Thanks, Lloyd. Yeah, and I should have mentioned, you know, if anyone has any questions or anything, just feel free to stop me. So as I mentioned, we have 3 standing committees now with the new governance charter, and I think I sort of walked through what those are. In terms of the membership of the standing committees, the membership is made up of HSAC members, but also CoC members. We have this CoC liaison role that was created in order to provide a greater opportunity for CoC members to really participate in governance. And so the CoC liaisons can make up to 1/3 of the membership on the standing committees. And we do, and that only applies to policy and planning and performance management, because of course the executive committee is made up of officers and the chairs of the committees. But we do have a number of CoC liaisons that serve in those roles to help us with our governance. And I should mention those CoC liaisons are full participating and voting members of the committees that they serve on. All right, next slide. So I'm trying to kind of speed through this just to get us up to speed. I know we started very late. So I think I sort of went over what the primary roles of the committees are, just glancing at this to see if I miss anything. Oh, one thing to mention is the executive committee is tasked with working with us on our approach for preparing the collaborative application. And of course that's relevant because that'll be coming up. And it'll be great to have that more collaborative approach to figuring out how we're going to work together as a community to turn in the best collaborative application that we can. And then the executive committee also designates the HMIS lead agency and appoints the representatives to the advisory body that we have with all 3 COCs that are in our current HMIS system. I think that covers the gaps that I didn't cover before. Any questions about the executive committee before I move on? Okay, next slide. So policy and planning, this is its membership. I talked about the CoC liaisons. You can see who those liaisons are currently. And policy and planning, of course, can appoint subcommittees to address special topics and bring back, recommendations for them. So that's something that either of the committees can do. Next slide. So in addition to what I mentioned about policy and planning, they are tasked with overseeing an annual gaps analysis. And so we'll be doing that for the first time with them this year. They are also tasked with working with the city to approve a plan for the point in time count, and as well as approving HMIS policies and procedures. They also are the primary group that is developing working with the city to develop the 5-year plan for ending homelessness that we're supposed to do every 5 years, and to recommend that for approval to the full HSAC. So if you've been around for a while, you can see that there's a lot of things here that might have been written in, but we hadn't totally been implementing, like the 5-year plan, so or the annual gaps analysis. So with the new governance charter, we're really trying to get those things up and running, and especially working with the committees to do that. Of course, COVID has put a bit of a wrench in that plan, but we do really still hope to be on course to conduct these things to get more of a cohesive vision for the CoC. All right, so the last subcommittee here is the Performance Management Committee. And as you can see, there are a number of CoC liaisons on this one as well. Next slide. And, in addition to the kind of broad view I gave of what they do, we can point out that they are the primary group looking at project performance. So they do conduct the mid-year and the annual CoC performance evaluation that we'll be presenting on soon. And they do set performance improvement plans and approve performance improvement plans for projects that are below that performance threshold. And they also approve the evaluation tools, the scoring tools, when we have funding competitions that are overseen by the CoC. So one of the sort of confusing things that, folks can point out is that, sometimes the CoC seems to be in charge and sometimes it's the city. And one of those distinctions is that the city serves in this dual role because we have entitlement funds that the city oversees, like our ESG funds and like our CDBG funds. And then there are funds that are governed at a higher level that the CoC has autonomy over. So that would be like the CoC competition that's overseen by HUD, as well as the state ESG competition that we make recommendations for annually. And so when it is the CoC that is kind of in charge of that ranking process, that's where the Performance Management Committee approves those scoring tools. Whereas if it's an entitlement fund, the city oversees that process. But I should mention that one thing that we're really trying to do is to, be more collaborative and take this opportunity with the newly structured Performance Management Committee to get their feedback, even if they don't officially have to approve a evaluation tool. And that's something that we've been doing with them, even with the entitlement funds, trying to get their input into the best way to approach approach evaluation and scoring, even when they are entitlement funds. Next slide. Oh, and I think I saw some things in the chat. So Carolyn asked, will these slides be available for reference? Yes, absolutely, Carolyn, they will be. We will send them out. So this may lead you to say, well, if all of these things are delegated to all of these committees, what does the full HSAC do? And so these are the tasks of the full HSAC. So they designate the collaborative applicant. They approve CoC and ESG funding recommendations. So those recommendations are made by performance management to HSAC, but HSAC does have that final approval. They approve CoC and ESG funding priorities. So something I may not have mentioned is that policy and planning is tasked with making recommendations for funding priorities, but it is the full HSAC that approves those. They do approve that 5-year strategic plan developed by policy and planning. They approve policies and procedures unless they've delegated that responsibility. So for instance, in the case of coordinated entry, the HSAC has delegated the ability to change coordinated entry policies and procedures to policy and planning. So policy and planning can approve those themselves. But unless they've made that delegation, they still have the final say into what gets approved and put into the policies. Just a reminder if everyone can mute themselves, thanks. They direct committees to address topics and issues. So if there's an issue that's of particular interest or concern to the HSAC, they could ask one of the committees to work on that and develop recommendations around it. And then of course, they also serve in this advisory body to the city and the county, as we mentioned, that dual role that they have. Next slide. So that leaves the full CoC. And one thing that we noticed is that folks seem to be confused about, well, what does it mean when we have a full CoC meeting? You know, how is that any different than the HSAC meetings? You know, and we'd received input that maybe moving to more of a town hall style meeting could help folks differentiate. So we've definitely done some brainstorming and gotten some recommendations from the executive committee about how to make those meetings feel more participatory, and that's something we're going to be looking at, because we do want it to be clear that those full CoC meetings are full CoC meetings, and they are an opportunity for the entire community to talk and give input. And so we are going to be looking at making those meetings more distinct and more participatory, with the first one, since the new governance charter was approved, I think coming up in, I believe we've moved it to June of this year. And so some things to know about full CoC meetings. As a voting representative for the CoC, any CoC member can participate in discussion during full CoC meetings. So it's, you know, open town hall style. You don't have to just be an HSAC member. Each organizational member's voting representative or alternate can vote, so each organizational member gets 1 vote. And then each individual CoC member can vote as well. So that's really an opportunity for the entire community to give feedback. And there are certain things that the full CoC has to approve. Just a reminder to mute yourselves. And that includes changes to the CoC governance charter and appointments to the Ombudsman panel. So this June meeting will be an opportunity for us to try out this more town hall style, and we're going to be reaching out to CoC work groups to be presenting and providers to be presenting. We really want it to be an opportunity for the community to speak about what they're working on, and for the HSAC as well to hear about what they're working on. So that's something to be aware of is coming up. So I think I talked a bit about the CoC work groups, but right now we have 2. We have the housing leadership team, which was formerly the housing results team, and then we have the youth work group, but we could have more. You just have to say you want to create one, and then the HSAC votes, and we can create a CoC work group, and then anyone can join. So that's just something to be aware of. All right, so membership of the CoC. So as you are all aware, because you are here, membership requirements for the CoC have changed as of the new governance charter being approved. And the thing is that what we realized before was that a lot of folks weren't clear on whether or not they were a CoC member, and even staff weren't clear. And so we wanted to create some real, what does it mean to be a CoC member? What are the expectations of you? And make that meaningful. And so the basic expectations for CoC members are that you sign an annual membership agreement. So before you just signed a membership agreement once, now you have to sign it annually. And the reason for that is because we want this to be active. If you're a CoC member, we want to know you're actively engaged, you're actively involved. And so that is sort of re-upping your membership each year. And there are now 3 organizational membership types, and each of those have different expectations and standards related to them. I believe I should go into more detail on that on the next slide. Yes. So of course there's an individual membership for folks that are currently or formerly homeless. And this is a change. Before we had a more open individual membership, but upon reflection, we really determined that this is the purpose of that individual membership, is to be for folks with lived experiences. And then we have 3 types of organizational membership. Homeless service providers, so those are those organizations that, you know, are providing services to those experiencing homelessness, and who, you know, have really designated services. So not just a organization that some folks in a program might be homeless, but really that they have specific programs for people experiencing homelessness. Funders, which are organizations that fund homeless services, and then community partners, which is everyone else. So that can include, you know, faith groups, different community interest groups, really other nonprofits and service organizations that are providing services related to homelessness, but not specifically for people experiencing homelessness. And the expectations of the members are based on the membership type. Each organizational member appoints a voting representative and alternate. And hopefully that's who's on this call. Do you want to go to the next slide, Ruby? So some examples of homeless service providers include, you know, the more obvious ones: emergency shelter, homeless diversion programs, rapid rehousing, PSH, but also transitional housing that's specifically for people experiencing homelessness, street outreach programs, supportive services projects that are designated for people experiencing homelessness, homeless day centers, as well as bridge housing, which we don't currently have in Durham, but we could. So who's not a homeless service provider? So I tried to come up with some examples to help guide y'all. So general case management, that's just provided to folks in the community, but maybe isn't specifically for people experiencing homelessness. Employment assistance that might benefit people experiencing homelessness, but isn't specific to them. Landlords that partner with us, they could be community partners, but they wouldn't be considered a service provider unless they were also providing services. Reentry programs, halfway houses that don't specifically designate for homelessness, educational programs, schools, educational providers, and healthcare providers as well. So that's just some examples to help guide you when you're trying to figure out, is this a homeless service provider or not? So your membership requirements: you have to attend at least 1 full CoC meeting annually. You have to attend your CoC orientation within 6 months of the initial membership, which is why we're doing this. And just to clarify, that's your initial membership. So you don't have to redo this every year. This is, you know, one time and you're done, unless your membership lapsed, or you know, we asked you to attend something because maybe we have some major changes and we're gonna re-up the orientation. But generally, this is a one-time thing. And then to follow the CoC policies and procedures as applicable. And this is really important to clarify, is that if you are in the CoC as a homeless service provider, your programs that are designated for people experiencing homelessness, we know that some of you are homeless service providers in some program areas and aren't in others, but your homeless services programs must follow standards of the CoC as they apply to that program type, even if you do not receive CoC funding. So this is something we really want to highlight, as to clarify that expectation, is that you're agreeing as a CoC member to follow those standards and saying, yes, we agree and want to participate in the system as it's been laid out. Funders, on the other hand, should require that their funded homeless services projects follow applicable standards, and that's the agreement that they're making to be a CoC member. So just to pause here, any questions? All right. You know, there are requirements, but we think there are also a lot of benefits to being in the CoC, and we really wanted to make those clear as we were clarifying what it was to be a CoC member. So you do get to vote and participate in full CoC meetings, and this is an old slide from our first deck, so it said May 2020, that this was before the next full CoC meeting got moved to June 2020. An opportunity to become a CoC liaison on a standing committee, as you see a number of organizations have taken that opportunity to serve on a CoC Ombudsman panel and review grievances. You have to be a CoC member to apply for project funding from the city related to homelessness or CoC funding. You can form CoC work groups. You get your name included on our website if you want it there. And you'll receive CoC communications, and you'll have the opportunity to participate in trainings provided by the CoC. Our next trainings, we have a fair housing training coming up. Hopefully, I'm not sure, Lloyd, if that's been canceled, you can let us know, but if hopefully it'll still happen. And then we have a motivational interviewing training that we're offering in August, and there'll be a registration coming up in the near future for that as well. Next slide. Any questions or comments? That's sort of the end. You can stay on questions and comments, Ruby. That's the end of our overview of the governance. So if you have any questions about governance or CoC membership, this is the time to ask that.
I have a question. This is Carolyn. In this time of transition from having to sign the agreement annually and one time and you're done, how do we know our status?
Yeah, so Ruby, feel free to chime in, but I think that what we're planning is to notify CoC members when they need to re-up their status annually. Is that right, Ruby?
Yes, it's annual, so the next update should probably be in August or September.
So you'll receive a communication saying, heads up, your membership is due for renewal.
Thank you.
Analea, this is Lloyd. Would you say a further word about the work of the work groups, and maybe Alex Ombudsman might be willing to share some about what the youth work group is involved with doing, and just kind of the vision for work groups and their relationship to the broader CoC?
So the idea for CoC work groups is really, we want, like we said, before it seemed like folks didn't really know, am I in the CoC? What does that mean? And previously, the only real way to have a formal group that was working on something was to be an HSAC committee, which didn't make sense for every group because not every group is really a governing body. Some groups are working on special projects or are opportunities for providers to come together. And so we wanted to have a clear and meaningful way for the CoC membership to be more participatory and for community leadership to be recognized, because there's a lot of awesome leadership that's happening in the CoC that really doesn't require a catalyst from the HSAC or from the city, and just needs to be recognized because it's already happening. And so the work groups are really envisioned as this opportunity to have that CoC membership be more participatory in terms of collaborative work. Alex, I don't know if you want to say anything about the youth work group.
Sure. Yeah. So for a number of years, it was a subcommittee at one point, but for a number of years, we had been working with agencies and programs that serve young, transition age youth, ages 16 to 24, to work on coordinating services for them better and improve housing options. And as some of you probably aware, the adult homeless system doesn't particularly work well. I mean, this is true across the country. It's not just a Durham issue. But the adult shelters and coordinated intake and all of these systems don't particularly work well for transition age youth. So one of the things we're doing, kind of working with, we're working to figure out better ways for the new kind of coordinated entry process to kind of serve young adults in a more meaningful way. That can be done in a number of fashions. We're also working on a project called the Hub. That would be a kind of drop-in resource center for young adults. That's pretty much on hold right now. you know, we don't, you know, we've met some, but the idea behind that would be kind of one place where a young person can go for help with housing or employment or education. But again, kind of even before this kind of new reality, things were kind of in stasis with that just due to lack of funding. Yeah, we've had, you know, some of those groups have included up to, you know, 40 different organizations. So, and, you know, I report back to the HSAC about what I'm doing, and yeah, that's basically it.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, and for those who are interested in maybe the housing results team, the work of that group is, which was also previously a standing, or when we called them subcommittees, which I changed those to standing committees because it didn't really make sense. You know, if the HSAC is called a committee, but it's actually a board, and so, you know, if it's, anyways, it's confusing. So it has committees. It's not exactly to have a subcommittee of a subcommittee. Anyways, yeah, so the housing results team focuses, that's led by the Community Empowerment Fund in their work on the landlord engagement project and on opening doors. Their work is to bring landlords and service providers together in order to improve the housing options and housing outcomes for people experiencing homelessness. So they really focus on making sure that there are housing options available. And Kevin Atkins from CEF leads that, if you are interested in that work. All right, well, if there aren't any other questions, we can move on to Lloyd. You want to pick up from here?
Okay, the next session is a review of our project standards. The original agenda, I believe, called for a 15-minute break at this point. Do we want to continue with the break, or do we want to continue with reviewing the standards? What's the group's desire?
My thinking, Lloyd, was that because we got started so late, we should just keep going. But if folks have a need for a break, of course, there's, you know, that's understandable.
Okay, Tim says happy to keep going. No break needed. All right, so maybe we'll take a brief break after this presentation. Well, again, welcome everyone. Glad you're with us. The project standards, first of all, I want to distinguish, you see on this slide, two words that often are used synonymously. We use the word program, talk about program standards, even there in the link, and we then talk about project standards. I am trying to distinguish, at least for the purposes of this presentation, the program would be referring to a particular funding program. For example, HUD has the Continuum of Care program and the Emergency Solutions Grant programs, which provide funding to people, to organizations that are serving the needs of homeless people. And then the projects are actually the individual efforts of particular organizations to do the kind of activities described here. We have 4 sets of project standards, one specifically for street outreach projects for emergency shelters, a combined standard for rapid rehousing and prevention projects because there's some similarity in the way that those projects are intended to help people at risk of homelessness or homeless people return to permanent housing, and then a set of standards for our permanent supportive housing projects. Next slide, please. So the format of each set of standards, we took this format and we're good at pirating, we might say, from other communities. non-copyrighted materials, and we took the format and much of the content of our current standards from the Balance of State Continuum of Care that is led by the North Carolina Coalition to End Homelessness as the lead agency for the Balance of State CoC. But the format of each of the standards is basically as given here: an overview and introduction addressing the general ideas of that particular project type, expectations for the project type, set of definitions that, as you consider each set of standards, would be consistently the same definitions in each standard. They don't necessarily vary. And then the performance standards, which may vary somewhat for each project type, but have a lot of similarities, as well, as we'll see when we look at the summary information. Next slide. So expectations, as Hanalea has already indicated, the Durham Continuum of Care expects that all homeless projects receiving public funds from whatever public source must adhere to these performance standards. We have the sources listed here. Durham County also provides some funding to organizations in Durham that are providing services and shelter assistance, particularly to people experiencing homelessness. And we have coordinated with Durham County as well to create the expectation that their organizations and projects also must implement the performance standards that have been adopted by the Durham CoC. And we're also recommending that projects funded through other sources also follow these standards. We do not have, you might say, a carrot or a stick to encourage projects. Primarily, funding is the primary carrot that we can use to encourage projects to adopt these standards and implement the standards. And if projects have received public funding, the possibility of losing that funding would also serve as some kind of stick to encourage projects to, again, maintain implementation of the standards. And as you might see, if you review the project standards, any one of them, our vision is a high standard of care. These standards are intended to be a tool to help us provide the best level of care, the best level of service across the board that we can for people experiencing homelessness, knowing that every individual person, no matter what their housing status or economic status, deserves the best that we can provide for them.
Lloyd, if I can jump in here, I just want to point this out, and some may have noticed it, is there is a gap and a discrepancy, because the new CoC governance charter doesn't distinguish funding sources. If you're a homeless service provider in the CoC, you are expected to follow CoC standards for your project type, regardless of funding source. But the project standards that Lloyd is going over now, or program standards, whichever is correct, because I'm not quite sure, Lloyd, what you would tell me, but those are older and have not been updated in quite some time. And so they're still talking about funding source. And so I just want to point out that the governance charter and the membership requirements do have that higher level of expectations, but the specific project/program standards still need updating to reflect that. So that's where that discrepancy comes in, just in case that had confused anyone.
Right. Indeed, thanks. There's obviously a lot of work to be done to prevent and end homelessness in Durham and across the nation. A lot of it really depends on human capacity, right? As we've already shared with the COVID-19 pandemic, pretty much everybody's efforts have been focused on keeping people safe and healthy, maintaining social distance, and we haven't been focused on doing much else. We certainly could, be working to update these project standards and doing a whole lot of other things, improving our coordinated entry system, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of it has to do simply with the capacity of all of us to work together and to make things happen. And so we continue to work to improve our system and to collaborate more effectively with one another and with other community partners. And it takes a lot of time. One of the things that people would know about me is that I've been involved with the work of the Durham Continuum of Care for 2 decades plus, which I think is probably the longest of any particular person on the call today. And I've seen tremendous growth and tremendous improvements in the way services and housing are being offered to homeless people. But we continue to know that we have more needs, and the COVID pandemic is challenging for our homeless housing system as well as for a whole lot of other systems. The healthcare system is challenged by the pandemic seriously, as we've seen, but in general, a lot of our services for people are being challenged during the pandemic. So those are our expectations. To move on to definitions. These definitions are pretty much included in each set of standards. There's descriptions of some of these in a particular standard that perhaps are a bit more detailed, depending on the relationship of the standard to these definitions. So obviously, for example, you'd find more information about rapid rehousing and prevention and diversion in that standard than you would in the street outreach standard. But in general, you'll find information about these definitions in each standard. Next slide. So the next series of slides are going to focus specifically on, again, some common standards that we have common statements around several performance standards in each project standard area: street outreach, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, et cetera. But how those standards are applied is detailed in what are called benchmarks, or there's more descriptions exactly what we are seeking in that particular project type. But in general, when you look at personnel, the people who are performing the work, our standards are that we want adequately staff services with qualified personnel to ensure the quality of service delivery, effective project administration, and the safety of project participants. So these can seem kind of basic, but it's important to, again, highlight that we want high quality delivery of services. We don't want to settle for just average. We want to continue to strive to improve. There are various organizations that talk about continuous quality improvement. How do you do that in an organization of any type? We encourage that, and that's why we have the standards. Effective project administration. I reviewed the standards this morning. All of them call for project administrators that, in terms of personnel, have at least a bachelor's degree, an undergraduate degree in a human services field, or perhaps public administration, or a field that's related to the project and what the project is intending to do. And then we're concerned also about the safety of project participants, whether those individuals are unsheltered people or people in permanent supportive housing. We want people to be safe and to uphold their human dignity, and staff need to be attentive to that. Next slide. Similarly, client intake standards would be similar across the board, no matter what particular project type you're looking at. We're expecting all of our projects to actively participate in Durham's coordinated entry and assessment system by only taking referrals from the coordinated assessment system for their project. This specifically relates to especially shelters and rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing projects in terms of taking referrals. A brief word about the coordinated entry and assessment system, which in Durham is called the access point, primarily is called Entry Point Durham. But Entry Point is simply the primary entry, front door, if you will. But the whole coordinated entry and assessment system encompasses more than just how people access homeless services. It also includes, as this says, how we're assessing them for what their overall needs are, especially what their needs are for housing and shelter assistance. Do they need more assistance? Part of the assessment needs to be, can we prevent or divert them from entering a shelter or divert them from becoming homeless in the first place? If we can't, they're interested, we can offer them shelter opportunities as we have those opportunities available. Then once people are actually homeless, we want to quickly work to make referrals for housing opportunities. We know that's those of us who are involved with this work and have been involved for some time know that getting people from homelessness back into permanent housing takes longer than all of us would like it to take, but we continue to work to reduce the time that we need to move a household from homelessness into a permanent housing opportunity. And the other key step of the coordinated entry and assessment system with referrals is prioritizing referrals, right? Prioritizing those most in need for the limited housing opportunities that we have available to serve people experiencing homelessness in our community. Next slide. Case management. We are trying to establish a standard across our entire system that says that all of our projects would provide at least access to case management services by trained staff to each individual or family in the program or project. That needs to be a given, that we are helping people as they come into an experience of homelessness, case management, to try to help them get out of homelessness as quickly as they can, realizing that experiencing homelessness is not good for the human person. Next slide. Similarly, when it comes to ending a person's participation in the project or evicting them from a housing opportunity, evicting them from shelter, evicting them from a rapid rehousing project and or the housing that they are in. We're saying as a community that termination should be limited to only the most severe cases. Termination can happen, but projects should exercise sound judgment and examine all extenuating circumstances when determining if violations warrant project termination. We have, Analea has reviewed the Ombudsman panel. We have put in place over the last year a community, a board to hear client grievances. So this is one area of our project standards that we will be updating. But currently we do talk about a board to hear client grievances, and we have put that in place. Again, we can remind ourselves that homelessness is a very stressful experience in people's lives. If we think about our own experience right now with COVID-19, it's a stressful time because I think for all of us, because we're thrown out of our normal, usual routines. We're not able to interact with others as we had become accustomed to. We're not able to work in the same ways that we had been accustomed to. So there's a lot of change going on across the world, and certainly in this nation, brought on by this pandemic. And when we see or experience the stories, and listen to the stories of people experiencing homelessness during this pandemic or at any other time, we can be mindful that it's a very stressful experience. And sometimes if you compound the stress that is a part of that experience with the health challenges, physical disabilities, other disabilities, mental health disabilities that many homeless people experience in their lives, we can understand that people experiencing homelessness are not ordinarily, probably, and many times, operating with their best selves, right? In ways in which they might normally respond to life if they weren't experiencing all of the stress and all of the other challenges in their life. So it becomes particularly important, if we have a sensitivity for that, that project people, project staff and projects really exercise good judgment when they're working with people who have done things wrong, who have made what we would consider bad choices, and sometimes seriously bad choices. We do need to keep everybody safe. Safety is a priority. So when that's challenged in some ways, actions need to be taken. But sound judgment is really crucial, and that's the whole focus of the discrimination standard. And we just want to continue to encourage our projects to limit termination to the most severe cases. Next slide. Similarly, all projects need to maintain client and project files, and projects need to keep the project files up to date and confidential to ensure effective delivery and the tracking of the services throughout our system. There should be a confidential trail in the homeless management information system or in other systems, so that as a client might experience various projects in the continuum of care, we can recognize and provide the kind of assistance to the individual or household that they really need. So all projects need to keep client and project files. Next slide. Finally, all projects need to be involved in evaluation and planning. As we've already referenced, the Performance Management Committee of the HSAC will be working to evaluate all projects in our community to look at how well they are implementing the standards, how well they are providing services to people experiencing homelessness in our community. And so the standard is that projects would work with the community to conduct ongoing planning and evaluation to improve their projects to do a better job meeting the needs of individuals and families experiencing homelessness. And certainly we recognize again with the pandemic, the needs of individuals and families can change. And so projects need to change sometimes as well. You know, I started doing this work way back when in the last century. 1994 is when I started working in with homeless services and working with homeless people. We don't expect that 25 plus years later that we would be doing things the same way. And so projects need to be willing to improve and to regularly, and with our system, evaluate how they're doing things and look at ways to improve their projects so that they can improve their performance on the goals that have been set by the CoC in our system performance measures from our federal partners at HUD. Next slide. So we're moving into a series of slides that look a little more closely at the individual project types. This first one is talking about prevention financial assistance. And we're saying that prevention projects should assist participants in staying in their current housing situation if that's possible, or assist households at imminent risk of homelessness to move into another suitable unit as defined under the specific project type. So kind of state somewhat the obvious, but we want our standards to, we write out the obvious sometimes so that everybody is clear on what we're looking for. Next slide. Street outreach. Street outreach is very important work because, as we know, it works to locate, identify, and build relationships with unsheltered people with the goal of helping get them back into, especially into permanent housing. Connections to homeless assistance projects, mainstream social services, and income opportunities can be helpful in that process. The overall goal is to help unsheltered people get back into permanent housing. We're having some success with moving unsheltered people directly into permanent housing opportunities. It's very encouraging to look at some of the reports of some of our permanent supportive housing projects in particular, and see the number and percentage of people that move directly from the streets into permanent housing. And if we can bypass the shelter, great. If time in shelter is going to help the person in the process of moving towards permanent housing, that can be a valuable time as well. But the key is street outreach needs to engage with people, to never give up on people. Even sometimes if safety is compromised, sometimes a street outreach worker can give the person on the streets a week or two or a month to reconsider, and then try to offer assistance again and support again. And particularly as unsheltered people discover that some of their neighbors, some of their friends are moving into permanent housing, maybe they'll begin to develop a relationship with the street outreach team to take advantage of housing opportunities as well for them. Next slide. Emergency shelter is intended to provide safe temporary housing options that meet participant needs in accordance with guidelines set by HUD. Ordinarily, HUD's overall goal is that people are in emergency shelter on average for 30 days or less. One of our concerns at the CoC lead agency level is when we look at our system performance measures, the average length of time that people have been staying in emergency shelter over the last couple of years has been increasing in Durham. I think just reviewed those numbers with some of our leadership earlier, and our average length of time in shelter has increased from like 80 days 3 or 4 years ago to I think 96 days. So that's about a 20% increase in the average. That's going in the wrong direction. But so we need to look as a community and as a CoC as to why our shelters are needing more time, taking more time to help homeless people. And part of the challenge there and the realization there is that if you have a shelter, for example, of 100 beds, and on average, people are in those 100 beds, an average of, say, roughly 90 days, that means over the course of a year, you can only provide shelter to 400 people on average, right? So once a quarter, the bed changes and somebody else moves in. On the other hand, if the average length of time somebody's in a bed is 45 days, you can serve twice as many people with the same number of beds. So with a 45-day average length of stay, a shelter would be able to serve about 800 people a year. So this is an important standard. Obviously, we want shelters also to meet participant needs. And this is where sometimes case management in a shelter can become very important. But case management that's focused not necessarily on maybe broader educational needs that a participant might have, but especially really helping the participant focus on what are their housing needs and working with them to identify a housing plan that can be effectively implemented with the person. Next slide. So rapid rehousing is, as many people on this webinar and call know, is a newer strategy to help people experiencing homelessness. It's been developing essentially over the last 10 to a dozen years based on some experiments, I think, in the decade of the aughts in this century, but it got a lot of impetus in the assistance that came out of the Great Recession of 2008, when the HPRP program received substantial funding, and communities, including Durham, received lots of federal funding to start implementing rapid rehousing. So the idea of rapid rehousing is that we're assisting homeless people to locate and move into safe, affordable housing with housing stabilization and case management services, with the goal of providing long-term stability in housing, but that the assistance, especially the rent assistance, is short-term assistance. Rent assistance in rapid rehousing projects is intended to be as brief as is needed to help the household achieve housing stability. And for some households, that might be a month. For other households, the rapid rehousing project type at the federal level allows projects to provide rent assistance for up to 2 years. And a lot of evaluations of rapid rehousing projects across the country have been done and are consistently show that rapid rehousing is a very cost-effective way of helping people regain permanent housing. Next slide. Service coordination is an important standard for all projects. Again, those of us familiar with the needs of people experiencing homelessness realize that nearly all of them have complex needs. And any one project oftentimes is not necessarily well suited to address all of the needs that the individual household or homeless person may have. And so service coordination realizes that we need community partners, and why we're delighted to have the community partners on the call today, as well as a variety of community partners in the Durham CoC to help us connect people experiencing homelessness with the resources and services in the community that can most appropriately address their needs and provide the assistance that the household needs. So there's a lot of mainstream resources. Our federal partners at HUD are particularly interested in making sure that our projects are helping people access, for example, SSI or SSDI benefits, Social Security benefits, helping them access employment services. Great to have Tim from Step Up on the call today, and that's an important resource for people in our community to help them become more employable. We also have, general unemployment benefits and the NC Works system, which has been overwhelmed by all of the unemployed people in the community with the pandemic. But nevertheless, those mainstream resources are available for people experiencing homelessness and others. And so projects need to be kept well informed about the variety of supportive services and other federal, state, local, and private assistance that households need, and be able to connect them. And that's certainly one of the things that as the CoC lead agency, we continue to encourage and try to foster that knowledge base, the network of care and NC Cares 360 and United Way 211. There's a whole wide variety of ways to help people get connected and to improve service coordination. Next slide. So finally, exiting and follow-up. What we're saying with this standard is that when a client is coming to the end of their eligibility for a particular project or in a particular project, the project staff make sure that the individuals and families are continuing to be able to access services that they might need even after they leave the project. Obviously, that depends a lot on the kind of relationship that the case managers and the project have developed with individuals while they're in the project, but we don't want to create a system and a way of doing business in our projects in which project staff simply say to the person, okay, tomorrow's your last day, bye. And there are opportunities, and projects should created a understanding that people may need assistance again in the future, and to create a kind of approach that says, if you need us down the road, don't hesitate to contact us again. And I think there's also some information in the standards that suggests that even if financial assistance has ended, case management assistance can continue for a limited period of time based on the needs of the project and the needs of the individuals that are ending their financial assistance from the particular project. Next slide. We added this addendum. VAWA stands for the Violence Against Women Act, which was adopted, passed by Congress several years ago, I think in about 2013, 2014. And it is a policy, federal act that is applicable to all housing providers, including our shelters and our homeless housing providers. And we have worked with them over the last year to make sure that they have a policy in place for the emergency transfer plan for victims of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And the plan should be distributed to all adults who are sheltered and are housed by the project, so that there's an awareness. We need to, as a community, I think, to create more of an awareness that number one, we need to create an awareness that domestic violence is unacceptable and should not be happening. But when it does, the survivors of domestic violence should be able to go to the project or their landlord and ask for assistance in finding a safe place to live and be housed. And plans per VAWA need to include definitions of an internal emergency transfer, an external emergency transfer, and a safe unit. You say briefly, internal emergency transfer is when a project receives a request from a survivor for moving into a different unit, and the organization and project works internally to perhaps find another unit that the survivors can safely move into and move out of the domestic violence environment. An external emergency transfer is in a situation where the project realizes that they don't have the resources internally, whether it's other housing units or other assistance that they can provide to the survivor to maintain the safety of the survivor. And so they need to work with external partners to identify other units, perhaps other community partners, to help the survivor move into a safe unit. And I think the key, as I recall, I haven't looked at this for a period of time since 2019, but I believe a safe unit is a unit that is defined as safe or seen as safe by the survivor, him or herself. And so if a survivor believes that a unit is not going to be safe for them, the project needs to take their word for it and not question it or not suggest that, well, seems safe enough for us, why don't you take it? We need to trust adults and trust their judgment on these kind of matters and concerns. Next slide. Okay, so I think I did that in pretty good time. How are we doing? Thank you, Alma, for confirming that the survivor defines their own safety, indeed. And we can't define it for them. It's one of the challenges. Any other questions, comments? Thank you, Alma, for confirming the VAWA Act was first signed in 1994. I think some of the current politics, I believe Senator, Joe Biden, when he was a senator, was involved in getting the first one passed. There have been a number of updates passed by Congress since that time. Any other questions about the standards? There is a summary document of the standards that we will send out via email to the participants on this call. And then the individual standards themselves are also available on the CoC website, durhamcoc.org.
Do we want to take a break at this moment or keep going?
It is 1:12. We've been at it for almost 2 hours. Why don't we say we'll reconvene at 1:25? And we'll start going again at promptly at 1:30.
Okay. I'm going to keep the meeting open.
Sure.
Hopefully it doesn't shut us down.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. See you in a little bit.
All right, are we ready to start back up? Seeing some yeses in the chat box. Ruby, are you there?
Yep, I'm getting the presentation ready.
Great, thanks. Oh, have I been muted this entire time that I've been talking?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay, sorry. Oh boy. Well, I was just asking, it looks, Lloyd and Ruby, it looks like we're doing really well on time looking at the agenda. And I just wanted to confirm that we have about 45 minutes left of stuff on the agenda. So I just wanted to confirm that I'm not missing anything, that we're doing pretty well on time.
I believe that's correct. Making good time.
Yeah, we're going by much faster than we went by last.
People have been way too quiet.
Yeah,
Had enough questions.
I think that's the effect of the online function. We have less discussion, but feel free to chime in. So yeah, I guess the last part here is going over cross-cutting policies, which Lloyd started talking about cross-cutting policies with the VAWA policy, and then I'm going to go over the 3 other cross-cutting policies. So the first of those is the CoC's Anti-Discrimination Policy, which was approved last summer 2019. Sorry, Ruby, could we go to the next slide? Thank you. All right, so some background is that federal rules require that CoC programs operate in compliance with federal non-discrimination and equal opportunity requirements. So they expect us as a CoC to pass anti-discrimination policies that demonstrate that we're in alignment as a community with these standards. And so Durham's anti-discrimination policy meets these requirements, as well as sort of goes above and beyond those requirements to address gaps in the federal fair access requirements. So there are some groups that are not protected as a protected group in the federal requirements that are included in Durham's policies. And so we'll really focus on those in this presentation. Next slide. So on a basic level, homeless service providers are required to not discriminate on the basis of any protected characteristics. So those include the federally protected groups as well as those that are included in the CoC's policy. So of course, the federally protected groups are race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, disability, age, and gender. And then Durham has added in the LGBTQ IA, and actually we did not correct this. We were corrected in the last presentation that A should not say allies there. And actually our policy says allies, so we are going to need to make that correction. We primarily use the balance of state policies as our guideline for this, and so we learned that that acronym actually should not say allies at the end. And then marital status as well. Next slide. So before I go into the specifics, I just want to make it clear that, here, especially, of course, if you receive any federal funding, you're required to comply with federal non-discrimination policies, which include things like not discriminate based on the age of a child, which had historically been a practice. But we're expecting that providers have participated in fair housing training, understand those standards. And so here we're really focusing on the places where the CoC's policy goes above and beyond those standards. And that really is where we talk about the LGBTQIA status and gender identity in particular. So if anyone has any questions just generally about the non-discrimination standards, let us know, but we're really going to focus here on this piece. So on a basic level, the policy says that the CoC as a whole and the providers in the CoC will ensure equal access for all individuals to programs and their families in accordance with a client's gender identity. So we aren't providing services based on biological sex or sex at birth, but in terms of self-identified gender identity. Next slide. So some specifics that are important to note. What does it mean not to discriminate based on gender identity? So some important points here. The policy clarifies that a service provider should never ask about a person's anatomy or medical history beyond elements necessary to provide services. So this is something I know when I was a service provider, I experienced trying to make referrals to certain programs for folks that were gender non-binary or identified as trans, that the program would ask about the person's anatomy or their biological sex, which is really considered discrimination by the Durham CoC. So you should never require an individual's gender identity to match the gender identity listed on their ID or other documents. So what we know is that it can be very difficult for individuals to go through these lengthy processes to get their gender change on official documents. And so we are going off of what an individual states their gender identity is, not what is on their IDs. And finally, that if a program administers medication, that they should be administering hormones and other medications that are part of gender affirming healthcare. So programs should never be withholding prescribed medications related to gender identity if generally medication administration is part of their program. Any questions about this? Okay, next slide. So the next piece of the policy specifies that services should be according to and respecting gender identity. So what does that mean? Some guideposts here that are included in the policy. Programs should never assume gender identity. This is really important. And what we know is that, you know, without specific training and organizational practices put in place, people will make assumptions. So you have to train your staff and put in place protocols at your organization to ask about gender identity so that people have an opportunity to disclose and not make those assumptions. You should have practices at your organization to verify and record the client's gender identity during that initial intake, as well as recording both their legal name and preferred name. Now, we did hear in the last time we did the CoC orientation that term preferred name is a little bit misleading, and a preferred name might be something like a nickname, whereas opposed to someone who has changed their name to confirm their gender identity, that would be the better term would be to say an actual name. Or we could just say, you know, the name they use, but that preferred name probably refers more to like a nickname. And of course we want to be respecting people's nicknames, but it's particularly important here where people's actual names, the name they use that affirms their gender identity, it could put them in danger if the wrong name is used and could be really re-traumatizing. This is really important, not just that information is asked for and recorded during the intake, but that you have processes in place for your staff to communicate throughout that agency what is needed. So in terms of here's what this person's gender identity is, here is the name that should be used with them, so that they're not having to correct people or retell that information over and over again, which again can be very re-traumatizing. So it's not just asking, not assuming, but it's also making sure that there are protocols in place to inform the agency of that, and that your staff know to check that place, that's part of your protocols. You should, of course, always use the client's preferred name, or in this case, actual name and pronouns when speaking to the client. So something that you know, we're still struggling with, honestly, as a CoC, but something we're working to get better at is stating our preferred pronouns. It was something we could have done today, and again, oversight, when you're in group settings or even in staff meetings, in order to create an opportunity, an open door, and normalize that idea that people have different pronouns, and that we shouldn't assume. And train your staff on how to do that. Not everyone is that comfortable with using different types of gender pronouns, like they or theirs can be difficult for people who haven't experienced that. So that might take some practice and some coaching for your staff. And of course, at a basic level, address and serve clients based on their stated gender identity. All right, any questions about this? Next slide. All right, confidentiality and privacy. So programs need to be honoring clients' requests for private space to complete intake and data collection. So of course, to the extent that it's possible to give that privacy, particularly if, you know, a client may be asking for privacy because something they need to disclose feels unsafe in a less private setting. Honor the request for accommodations based on their personal safety and privacy concerns. So if someone, for instance, needs to be able to change privately or a separate bathroom accommodation, they should be given that to the extent that it's possible, but never require an accommodation. An accommodation is something that's asked for, not something that's required. So you should never be requiring someone to, for instance, you know, have a separate bathroom or something if that's not something they want. It's available, it's not required. Tell only essential staff identified by administrators about a client's transgender status in order to ensure equal access and safety. So this is on a need to know basis. So what everyone needs to know is what that person's gender identity is, the pronouns that they use, and the name that they should be addressed with. What not everyone might need to know is that that person is identifying as transgender. And so really think through who needs to know that at your organization. And this is important, treat a client's gender identity and sex assigned at birth as confidential medical information unable to disclose without a specific time-limited client consent. Similarly, a client's legal name shall be treated as confidential information. So the same you would do where if you had to disclose medical information, you would get specific consent from the client. That's what you would be doing here. So if this is something you need to share in order to make you know, make an appropriate referral, you need to get that specific disclosure, that specific consent for disclosure from the client in order to do that. Any questions about this piece? All right, next slide. Okay, so the Durham CoC has 0 tolerance for harassment, and we expect our providers to have 0 tolerance for harassment. So some important points in what it actually means to practice 0 tolerance. So you should be mediating and resolving conflicts between clients in a way that respects clients and treats them fairly. That seems obvious, that's basic. People should be treated fairly, people should be treated with respect. If there is harassment going on, programs should be taking immediate action to resolve inappropriate behavior. It doesn't matter who's doing that harassing. If it's staff, volunteers, contractors, clients, you need to take action. And importantly, in circumstances in which plans are made to move a client due to concerns by one client towards the gender expression of another, move the individual who has the concerns. So in other words, if someone says, I'm uncomfortable being in this space because of this person's gender identity, you don't move the person with the gender identity that is making that other person uncomfortable. You move the person that's being made uncomfortable, because essentially they're requesting to be moved. So you don't move someone else because someone else's discomfort, you move that person who has the discomfort. Does that make sense? I will take your silence as yes, it makes sense.
Hanalei, I'll chime in. I think this is can be particularly challenging for projects. I think sometimes clients who aren't comfortable will want projects to move the person who's transgender or who's non-conforming gender. And so I think it's important to say to the person who expresses this uncomfortableness, you're the person who is uncomfortable. So, you know, we're happy to try to make accommodations for you if that's what you want.
Yep, very true, Lloyd. Any other thoughts anyone has on this? Okay, next slide. Okay, so the policy has specific expectations about how issues related to space and gender identity should be dealt with. So when you are constructing or rehabbing, doing renovations on a property, so on a forward moving basis, you should include and promote privacy and safety in sleeping areas, bathrooms, and showers. So we understand that, you know, a lot of folks are using existing spaces and there's only so much that can be done with those. But when you are making changes, you should be making changes that allow for additional privacy. So that includes single stall bathrooms, private showers, and private sleeping areas to the extent that that's possible. Offer individual stalls in congregate bathrooms, urinals, and toilets, and shower heads to support client safety. And offer individual gender-neutral bathrooms and gender-neutral shower rooms. So again, this is all to the extent that it's possible in the space that you use, but when possible, this is what's expected. Any questions about space? All right, next slide. Okay, so that concludes our section on gender identity in the anti-discrimination policy. And the other piece that we really wanted to highlight here was the section on involuntary family separation. This is really important. So this is inconsistent with federal rules. Involuntary separation of family members is prohibited in projects funded through CoC and ESG dollars. So projects that receive these funds may not deny admission to any household on the basis of the age and/or gender of a child under 18, or the gender or marital status of a parent or parents. So there had historically been a practice, and still is in some places, we're lucky in Durham that we don't see this, a practice of not allowing, for instance, a family with a male child over the age of 12 or 13 to be admitted into a program. That is not allowed under federal rules for those that receive federal funds. And of course, similarly, you cannot require that parents be legally married, or require that parents have a specific gender identity. You know, you can't deny same-sex couples. Again, we're very lucky in Durham in our CoC to see a lot of really great inclusion in our programs, but this is something we wanted to highlight. Next slide. Okay. So in providing program assistance, programs cannot discriminate against a program participant on the basis of religion and religious belief. So of course we have faith-based programs in the CoC that provide wonderful services from their own faith background or their own values in faith, which is a wonderful thing. But what they don't do and what they can't do is to require that participants participate in a specific religious activity, or to make participants feel so uncomfortable if they don't participate in that religious activity that it's not really feasible for them to be included, or that a participant have a specific religious identity. Next slide. All right. So that is, wait, can you go backwards, Ruby? Okay, it just seems like it's a duplicate, that's fine. That is the end of our portion on the anti-discrimination policy. Does anyone have questions before we move on to complaint and grievance about the anti-discrimination policy?
I'll take a minute to chime in about the family separation and the presence of two or more adults in a household. I think sometimes it can be challenging for projects to make good decisions for particular households. For example, I can imagine a scenario where perhaps there is some abuse and violence going on, and the biological parent of the children in the household really would like to perhaps not have another adult with them in their room who maybe, emotionally or physically or otherwise abusive, but is really unable to say that directly. And so it can be, I think, sometimes challenging to projects to help households sort out those kind of challenges. So it can be really difficult if the biological parent, I think, in my view, would have the primary right to say, yes, we're presenting as a family, and this other person should not be staying with us, but they may need the project to help them make that stick in that family situation. So that can be challenging in some circumstances.
Yeah, Lloyd, I think you're right. And I think another situation that we see with that is programs struggling to figure out what to do when there is family violence or intimate partner violence occurring in the household, and the partner that is suffering the violence or the abuse does not wish to separate. That is something that we know that programs really struggle with, and because it makes the programs feel unsafe to have that violent individual present. And when those situations arise, we really encourage programs to reach out to the CoC for assistance and to engage with DCRC. Of course, we have Alma on. We're very lucky to have her on
Yes.
in order to problem solve, because what we never want to be doing is discriminating against the survivor because they're not ready to leave, because that is going to put that family in more danger, further isolate them and make it even harder for them to leave when they're ready. But of course, safety of of the program, when you're in, it's a little bit easier when you're in like a private unit, but in a communal space, that can be very difficult. And so trying to problem solve around how dangerous is this situation actually, are there ways that we can safety plan around this, reduce the danger, because we never should be requiring that a parent leave their partner in order to serve them. But of course, there are safety considerations. So we really encourage you to engage with us rather than trying to problem solve that on your own, because it is so complex, and we do understand that it is difficult. It's a difficult situation. Yep. Alma, you're absolutely right. All right. So we're going to move on to the client complaint and grievance policy. So this is another policy that is new to the CoC that was approved over the summer in 2019. So next slide. So this first section, so the complaint and grievance policy sets two standards. One is the standards for what agencies' internal client complaint policies need to look like. And the other one is a process, an external process by which clients can make a grievance to the CoC regarding their services. So we're going to start by looking at the standards for the agency's internal client complaint policy. Next slide. So these are the expectations for the internal complaint policy. So all of your programs need to have an internal complaint policy for clients to submit complaints. And these are the minimum standards that, that it needs to have. So the first thing is that the policy needs to allow for both verbal and written complaints. So if someone verbally makes a complaint, that shouldn't be treated like an invalid complaint. They should be able to say, I want to submit a complaint, and not have to put it in writing. There need to be multiple options for whom the client can submit a complaint to, including someone not involved in the original incident that the client is complaining about. So one of the things that is common to see is that you require a client to submit the complaint to their case manager, for instance. And that, if that was the policy, that would be in violation of the CoC standards. You can say a case manager is one option, but you need to have another option and someone who isn't directly involved with that client, so that they can submit that complaint to someone who wasn't involved in the incident that they're complaining about. There needs to be a stepped process. So if the process was you can submit to your case manager, and let's say maybe they were in compliant with number 2, you submit your case manager or the agency's director of services, and they will review it and make a decision. That would not be consistent with this standard, because what you have to have is you have to have a step process where there's an initial determination made, and then it can be appealed at least to one additional level. Ideally, what we want to see is multiple levels of appeals, but at a minimum, you have to have one additional appeal level. The clients must be given verbal and written notice of the complaint policy and the CoC's grievance process during their intake. So they need to be given that written policy, but it also needs to be explained to them verbally so that you know that they really understand it. The policy needs to describe how complaints are investigated and addressed by a manager not named in the complaint, including the time frame for decision and client notice. So again, in that step process, that process needs to include a review by a management level staff member who is not involved in the original complaint. So you need to have options for who's reviewing those complaints if the person reviewing the complaint is someone involved in direct services. And that needs to create a timeline of expectations that the client knows. Here's when I'll hear back. Here's when I'll be notified of a decision. The next expectation is that the policy must include a guarantee that clients will not experience retaliation. This is, I think, pretty straightforward. Is not just they shouldn't be experiencing retaliation, but it needs to be guaranteed in the policy itself. And finally, that the programs need to have a process for recording and in writing and storing for at least 3 years all client complaints and action, it should say storing records of all client complaints and action taken to investigate and address the complaint. So you need to have a record system that you maintain for at least 3 years of those complaints and the subsequent reviews and decisions that were made. Any questions about these basic expectations? All right, next slide. So some issues that we see with this, where are the red flags? Where do we see commonly programs not complying with this? So as I mentioned, requiring that the client file their complaint with their case manager or program manager, you need to have multiple options. Another issue is that you have 2 options, but both people were involved in the original complaint. So it's the case manager and their supervisor. They're both directly involved in working with this client. You need to have someone who's unbiased, who's uninvolved, that they can feel safe taking that complaint to. We see issues where the policy looks good, but frontline staff aren't held accountable for implementing the policy. So we see with situations where a grievance gets to the CoC because the client thinks they filed a complaint, but the frontline staff member who heard that complaint didn't treat it like a complaint. And in some cases, it seems like the frontline staff didn't really understand the policy. So you need to make sure that your staff really understand the policy, and that when someone is complaining, that they know how to clarify, are you filing a formal complaint, and that they know how to follow that process. That the information about the complaint policy is too convoluted, and clients don't understand it. So they need to be communicating in accessible lay language to clients, both in writing and verbally, making sure the clients really understand it. As I mentioned, one thing we see is that the client makes a complaint, but it's not treated as a formal complaint, right? It's just sort of, there's this process, but it's not followed. So, put in place that practice of, if a client is complaining, you're asking the client, would you like to file a complaint? Would you like us to review this? Proactively ask that question. Clients aren't informed of the CoC grievance process at the same time as the agency complaint process. So again, the standard is that at that initial intake, both the client complaint process and the CoC grievance process are explained. When a client is filing an agency complaint, that is a time when they need to be reminded of the CoC's grievance process. So they should be reminded at the time, we're going to review this, we're going to do everything we can to resolve it, but just a reminder, you also have the option to file a CoC grievance process if you're dissatisfied. We're not trying to hide the CoC grievance process. We're not trying to make it difficult to access. We want clients to know about it. This is a big one, and something that we've seen a few times, is that the way that the agency's complaint process is written or communicated makes it sound like the client has to file a complaint with the agency before they can go to the grievance, to the CoC's grievance process. So your policy should not say, if you're at the very end, if you're dissatisfied with our decision, you can go to the CoC's grievance. It needs to be clear that it's not just if you're dissatisfied with our decision, but if you don't feel like you can file a complaint with us, then you can go to the CoC. And so that really needs to be clear. And then finally, of course, no formal documentation or storage process for complaints. We need those records to be able to pull, again, if the grievance comes up at the CoC, we need to be able to pull the records of the complaints. All right, any questions about these issues that we see? Comments, thoughts? All right, next slide. Okay, so we wanted to share, so those were the basic standards. We wanted to share some best practices in developing your complaint policy. These are, the ideals that we would love to see programs So one best practice is to designate an independent ombudsman to field complaints. So this is somebody that is designated as the person that clients can go to confidentially to address a complaint. And this person is completely independent of the direct services. So it's someone that people can really feel this is, an independent third party, they're unbiased, I can talk to them. So that's really a best practice that you might want to consider. And that's someone that they can go to for that initial filing. The best practice is for this ombudsman also to be tasked with monitoring the implementation of the policy. So again, you have this unbiased party really as the eye for your organization about how these policies are being implemented, so that it's not the same people that might be getting the complaints against them and monitoring the implementation. Not because people don't have the best of intentions, but of course it can be very challenging when you're having clients make complaints against you or your program to be unbiased in that. And so the best practice really is to have a third party empowered to review that implementation. And then ideally, that independent ombudsman would actually be soliciting feedback from clients on their experience with the policy. So not just waiting until a problem arises, but really asking clients, do you feel like you understand it? When were you told about it? What questions do you have? What was your experience? Do you feel heard? Those kind of things. Ideally, you'd be doing regular training on the process for frontline staff. So like we said, one place where we see this fall apart is you've got a great policy and the frontline staff don't understand it and they're not held to it. And when they hear a complaint, they don't treat it like one. So, you've got to do those reminders and that regular training to make sure people really understand what's expected of them and can explain it to the clients. So, again, this is a best practice I think I talked a little bit about. When a client is disgruntled, actually proactively asking them, giving them the opportunity, would you like to file a complaint? Often folks are afraid to ask that because they feel like it's going to come back at them. But, making staff feel like, we're not going to be punishing you for complaints. We want to hear from clients that this isn't about punishing you, and really encouraging staff that the right thing to do. And the best performance for them is to proactively encourage clients to file complaints. The best practice is to allow clients to file an anonymous complaint, because one thing that we know is, of course, if a client files an anonymous complaint, you can't necessarily address it with that client. But if you see a trend, you may notice a trend that a number of anonymous complaints are filed, all substantiating the same thing. You may be able to address something as organizational leadership, and clients may be too intimidated or too fearful of retaliation to file that complaint with their name on it. So being able to file an anonymous complaint is extremely valuable to really hearing what's going on from the client perspective. Ideally, we would love to see the final level of escalation for the appeals in your complaint process going to an independent committee. So sometimes this is the board or a committee made up of people with lived experiences and staff. That's a wonderful thing to see, but some sort of independent body would ideally be the final level of review. And then we'd love to see regular and frequent reminders about both the agency complaint policy and the CoC grievance process. So this isn't just a one-time thing, but you're reminding clients that they always have this option and really making it accessible to them. Any questions about these best practices or thoughts about how maybe your agencies have found success with your complaint policy, or where you found challenges?
Finally, I'll chime in on the idea of the independent ombudsman. I think that's a great best practice. I think it can be initially challenging to say, well, who could serve in that role for our organization or our project, right? I wouldn't necessarily recommend current board members, because their role in leading the organization would be somewhat different than I think the ombudsman role. But perhaps, former board members, people who clearly have been involved with the organization, know well the organization. Perhaps a former board chair would be willing to serve for a defined term as an independent ombudsman. I think we need to realize that organizations and projects need to be very aware of the tremendous power imbalance in this kind of situation. I think we can recognize the power imbalance if we think about the relationship between a landlord and a tenant, and understand why tenants oftentimes are afraid to complain about the situation of their housing to the landlord, because they know that, you know, at some point the landlord may ask them to leave. So the project and the organization has tremendous power, right, in the relationship with clients. So what we're looking at in this whole grievance situation is, what can you do as an organization and a project to bring greater balance to that, to empower your clients to really contribute to creating an organization that is serving the client's needs as best it can. And so to try to create a partnership with the people coming through your project, to say this project is with you and for you, and we need you to help us do the best we can to meet your needs. So for example, case managers need to say to clients, we can't help you as well as we'd like to unless we have a clear understanding of what your needs are. So please feel free to, you know, state your needs to us, and we'll see, maybe we can address them. Maybe we can, you know, coordinate with other services in the community to address those needs. But similarly, coming back to the whole issue of complaints, it's not about, you know, creating a us-them relationship between the project staff and leadership and the clients, but creating a sense of that we are working together. We're all imperfect. We're all on the way. We make mistakes. Lord knows, live as long as I have, I've got plenty of mistakes that I've made. I think if we're honest with ourselves, we all have. But we can grow, we can change, we can improve. And the whole area around complaints needs to be around, help us improve the way we are serving clients. It's difficult work, but if we can create that a greater sense of working together to address the needs of clients and keep people safe, I think we can make tremendous progress. Thanks for letting me share.
Yeah, Lloyd, I think that was very well put. And one of the things that you really highlighted is that for these policies to be successful, it really requires staff that are not fearful of retaliation, right? Because what happens, I think, is that staff who fear being penalized for quote unquote mistakes, or even just, you know, for challenging experiences, may be fearful to be as encouraging of a client's complaint as a staff member who feels really like their leadership are allies in working with them. And so how to strike that balance between allying with your staff, saying, you know, we're here to support you. There's not, you know, this isn't going to be punitive if a client files a complaint, with balancing that with the need for independent review, and not, you know, not just always taking the staff member's side as challenging, but that is a really essential piece of success in these policies. All right, next slide. Okay, so next we're going to go into the CoC's grievance process. So again, before we were looking at that agency level complaint standards, and now we're going to go over the CoC's grievance process that has been put in place. Next slide. Thanks. Okay, so if the client participates in your internal complaint process and they are still dissatisfied, or and this is a big important or, they feel they've been unable to participate successfully in the complaint process, the client may submit a formal grievance to the CoC lead agency. So again, clients aren't required to file an agency complaint first. They can submit with us if they don't feel safe or successful in filing the agency complaint. So clients can submit grievances online or bring a hard copy to the CoC lead agency. And of course, in these unique times, I guess hard copy isn't as much of an option. So that might be something to think through, but I guess we could always.
They could still mail it to us.
Yeah, they could mail it to us. They just have to get that. You might have to help your client in printing that out. All right, next slide. Okay, so our process for, once we've received that grievance, we start by reviewing the grievance for whether it's eligible for our process. You know, is it about a provider in the CoC? Did it occur in the last year? Is it a fair housing complaint? Because if so, that the city has a separate and legal process for fair housing complaints that we would like them to go through. Next, whether an agency complaint, and that says complain, but should say complaint, was submitted. So again, this isn't a requirement, but our goal is, if the client hasn't submitted that agency complaint, is to encourage them to do so and support them in doing that if they're willing. And then to collect any additional information needed to review the grievance. We may request, for this purpose, from providers documentation regarding the incident. So that includes case notes, incident reports, suspension reports, any complaints, any documentation of complaints that were filed, as well as the agency's policies and procedures that may be relevant to the complaint. Next slide. So once we've gone through this process, the complaint goes to the Ombudsman panel, which is not a subcommittee of the Performance Management Committee. That is outdated. We had to make it a separate panel that was appointed by the CoC, not by the HSAC, because the HSAC is subject to open meeting laws as a publicly appointed board. And of course, it is not appropriate for this Ombudsman panel to be open because we're dealing with confidential client information. So the Ombudsman panel is a 3 to 5 member, this slide is just so wrong. I'll have to replace this when we send these out. It has 3 to 5 members, but they are not appointed by the Performance Management Committee, and they are not all HSAC members. So they are, I think, some HSAC members, but also CoC liaisons. At least one member has to have experience providing direct services to homeless or other similar populations. And members have to recuse themselves from any grievance regarding an organization which they are currently formerly employed, or also which they are the board member of. All right, next slide. So it's important to note that the Ombudsman panel's role is not to instruct agencies to make a determination on the grievance, right? So the Ombudsman panel is not saying, you know, X agency, you need to respond to this grievance in this way. Their job is to determine the appropriate sort of resolution path. So that could include a CoC grievance mediation between the agency and the client. It could include a review of the grievance and a written response from the Ombudsman panel with assistance from the CoC lead agency. It could include a discussion with the subject provider regarding a solution, so some problem solving with the provider. Or in cases in which the grievance has implications for CoC policies, the resolution plan might include notice to the CoC Performance Management Committee and subsequent review for action steps. So this could particularly be relevant if the grievance is, if we've received a number of grievances showing a pattern of issues with compliance with CoC policies, then it could be taken to performance management for resolution. Any questions about this? Okay, next slide. So the CoC's grievance mediation process is staffed by the city's neighborhood improvement services. They serve as the mediators. We wanted to have an independent party mediating this that wasn't part of the CoC. And so NIS will do the mediation. They're trained in mediation for their role in the city's fair housing process. And also an added benefit is that they're experts in fair housing. So where resolution plans and grievances touch on fair housing issues, they can actually weigh in and provide that insight, which is really, really valuable to make sure that we're staying consistent with fair accommodations expectations. Next slide. So if it's determined that a client is going to be unable to successfully represent themselves in the mediation, they may be asked to appoint an advocate that can be at the mediation with them. The subject provider that's the subject of the grievance will be asked to appoint an ombudsman who's a management level staff member. And so this is management or executive level staff or current board members can serve as the appointed representative for the agency to be at the mediation. And this person has to have the authorization to make decisions on behalf of the agency for this mediation process to be successful. And then either the CoC lead agency or the coordinated entry administrator, depending on what the grievance is regarding, will send a staff member to be present at the mediation. And the reason why we are present, our role is to be the expert in the CoC's policies. So our job is, like NIS is the expert in fair housing standards. We're there just to make sure that any resolution plans are consistent with CoC policies. Next slide. So at the conclusion of the mediation, a resolution will be signed by all participating parties that will bind the parties to the terms of the agreement. So again, this isn't a process where we're going in and saying, the client needs to do X or the agency needs to do X. This is about them reaching a resolution that works for them. But when they reach that resolution, that's a binding agreement. The resolutions, like I said, are voluntary. We're just trying to create something that everyone can hold themselves to. And the coordinate entry administrator will follow up to verify that the parties are making a good faith attempt to follow the agreement. And if informal efforts to ensure good faith attempts to comply are unsuccessful, or if an agency shows a pattern of non-compliance, a report may be made to the CoC lead agency and the performance management subcommittee for response as appropriate. So again, we know that sometimes it may be difficult to follow the agreement because a client is not holding up their end, and we understand that. So the expectation is just a good faith try to follow it. Next slide. Okay, so that's it on grievance and complaint. Before we move on, does anyone have any questions or thoughts about anything we presented around the grievance policy? Okay, so we will be reaching out to all of you that are homeless service providers to provide us with your complaint policies within the next 30 days. So be aware of that. And any of you who receive CoC or local funding for homeless services, expect that this will be part of your monitoring, that you'll be in compliance with this policy, as well as the anti-discrimination policy will also be part of your monitoring. All right, so the final cross-cutting policy that we're going to go over is coordinated entry. There have been a lot of presentations on coordinated entry and particularly the new front door system, so we're not going to go into so much detail on that, but really focus on the things that kind of on a broad level folks need to know. Next slide. All right, so coordinated entry has essentially 3 essential functions. So coordinated entry is a system of policies and procedures that lays out how people enter and move through a homeless system. And a high functioning coordinated entry system can reduce entries into homelessness, it can end homelessness rapidly, and it can prevent repeat homelessness. And these policies follow people all the way from their first touch point in the system, all the way until they move on at the end of the system, and really has an impact on the entire system's functioning. Next slide. Okay, so like I said, we're not going in depth into these like 50 pages of policies here. We're just trying to give some broad overview of what is on a basic level expected of all CoC providers. So all CoC homeless service providers must participate in coordinated entry and follow policies as they apply to them. You have to post your notice of participation in coordinated entry where clients can see it. And no person may be turned away for services due to a lack of income, lack of employment, disability status, or substance use, unless your primary funder requires the exclusion. So if you have an exclusion here because your primary funder requires this, you need to notify the CoC, but otherwise these are not reasons you can deny a client. Agencies receiving public funds from homeless services and all front door units. So right now our front door units are entry point made up of VAWA and DSS, but we'll be adding on a street outreach front door unit in the next couple months as well. So front door units and those receiving public funds for homeless services are limited to 3 absences per year for each meeting type for which their attendance is required. So this includes like the by name list meeting and other such things as that you can be absent 3 times, you can send people in your place, but we expect participation. Next slide. All right, so during intakes, you must notify clients of their rights. And if a client later requests that information, they should be provided a written copy. So you can have as many client rights as you like, but at a minimum, they need to include the following: the right to be treated with dignity and respect, the right to submit internal complaints, the right to submit a grievance through the CoC's process, the right to be treated with cultural sensitivity, the right to have an advocate present during the complaint or grievance process, the right to request a reasonable accommodation in accordance with the project's tenant or person selection process, the right to accept housing or services offered or to reject housing or services, and the right to confidentiality and information about when confidential information will be disclosed, to whom, for what purpose, as well as the right to deny disclosure. Any questions about basic rights? All right, next slide. Okay, so any new homeless service provider, and keep in mind you are all new because everyone was new as of the new governance charter. So if you haven't provided these to us, you're in this category. Any new homeless service provider or program joining the CoC shall create and share with the Coordinated Entry Administrator, that's NCCEH, project policies and procedures that include program eligibility standards. So the reason for this is that the Coordinated Entry Administrator is tasked with being aware of available slots in housing, making sure that we are prioritizing accordingly. So they need to know what the eligibility criteria is and the intake process and the referral process so that they can support the homeless system in making that work. Anytime policies or procedures that affect program eligibility or decisions related to provision of services are changed, providers will provide updated policies and procedures to the Coordinated Entry Administrator within 2 weeks of the change. So again, the purpose for this is so that they can accurately be representing availability and eligibility for our different housing options and shelter options in the CoC. Each provider with homeless dedicated units will be required to participate in HMIS unless mandated by law or their funding source does not not to participate in HMIS. So for instance, we know that that DCRC is mandated not to participate in HMIS, so they have an equivalent system. But if you have homeless dedicated units, you are required to participate. Any questions about these?
Next slide. Okay. Can you go back one, Ruby? I think we just skipped one. Thanks. Okay, so really want to highlight here the language access policy. So if you receive federal funds, this is a requirement that you have from HUD. And this is something I think that Durham has really, you know, where I said that I think we're doing pretty well with the anti-discrimination stuff, and we see a lot of really positive things happening. This is something where I've seen us really struggling, which is to make sure that we have access for people with limited English proficiency. This is an area where the CoC seems to really struggle. So you need to take reasonable steps to offer coordinated entry process materials and instruction in multiple languages to meet the needs of minority and ethnic and groups with limited English proficiency. So, you know, that could mean translation of materials into languages where you have a number of clients, you see trends that this is a language that we need to translate our materials into. So again, consistent with the requirements that you have from HUD as you're receiving these federal funds. If you're receiving CoC, ESG, City of Durham, or County of Durham funds, you must have a written policy in place regarding fair access to services for clients with limited English proficiency. And that policy needs to establish reasonable steps that will be taken to provide meaningful access to services for clients with limited English proficiency. So what does meaningful access mean? We interpret meaningful access to mean that clients with limited English proficiency don't experience substantial differences in their access to homeless services or housing than clients who have sufficient English proficiency to communicate in English. So that means a client should not spend longer waiting for housing or shelter or services because they don't speak English and they're waiting for a translator, for instance. A client should not be more restricted in their housing options because they don't speak English. A client shouldn't receive less frequent case management because they don't speak English. So, you know, we strongly recommend using a language line. You know, you can pay as you use them, so we strongly recommend that all programs take advantage of a language line, which provides really easy access to translation on demand in order to make sure that clients are getting consistent services. And again, this is something we want to flag, that if you do receive funds from us, this would be something you'd be monitored on, and something we're very aware that we need to work on as a community. So if you have concerns about your language access plan, please reach out to us so we can support you, because we do really want to make sure that Durham is providing fair access to everyone regardless of language. Any questions about this? Okay, next slide. Okay, so so as I said, right now we have Entry Point as our main front door provider. We'll be bringing on a street outreach through Housing for New Hope in the next couple months. But you should be aware that there could be more front door providers, more people serving as an entry point into the homeless system. In order to do this, you submit a new hub request to the coordinated entry administrator saying, you know, we would like to be a front door into the homeless system. We would like to do those initial intakes. We'd like to work to divert clients. And particularly, we see a gap where the current coordinated entry system isn't really working or isn't accessible for this population that we work with. And so if you become a hub, you'd receive training from NCCEH on how to do that. But on a basic level, front door providers need to attempt to divert all clients. They need to screen all clients for intimate partner and family violence, for eligibility for housing opportunities for persons with AIDS programs, and for veteran status. They also need to participate in front door providers meetings where we all get together with shelters and front door providers and make sure that the system is working smoothly on the front end, and they need to participate in by nameless meetings. So if you're seeing a gap, if you see, hey, this population that we work with really isn't successful at accessing the system, you know, that's an option that you have. You could reach out to NCCH and say, hey, we're interested in becoming a hub. We want to learn more about what this means. And that's something that's available to you. Any questions about the hubs? Okay, next slide. Okay, so on a basic level, our front door providers follow a specific prioritization for emergency shelter referrals. So this prioritization focuses on 3 dimensions: unsheltered homelessness or fleeing violence, as compared to people that are at imminent risk; people with medical vulnerabilities that put them at medical risk if they are to be sleeping outside; and Durham residents. So residency isn't a requirement to get shelter in Durham, but it is a factor in prioritizing. So as you can see here, those folks who are Durham residents who have that medical vulnerability and are unsheltered are our highest priority for shelter in Durham. Clients cannot just be denied shelter because for just any reason. There are a very limited number of reasons why a program can deny shelter to a client, and they include: the client is not category 1, 2, or 4 homeless. What that means, the client is not sleeping in a location not meant for human habitation or a shelter. The client is not imminently at risk within 14 days of losing their housing, and the client is not fleeing violence. Clients who are imminently at risk of homelessness in another county. So let's say someone calls us from Orange County. They're saying, I'm staying with my sister in Orange County and she says I have to be out in a week. That person is not eligible for shelter in Durham. We want COCs to be working with those people to maintain housing there, not coming to Durham for shelter. In some cases, clients may be denied because they're a registered sex offender if there are children on the property, and that's really a shelter by shelter decision. But at the moment, both Families Moving Forward and Urban Ministries do not accept registered sex offenders. There is a suspension process whereby shelters can suspend clients for a certain amount of time. We don't do shelter bans anymore. We don't do lifetime bans, but there are certain circumstances related to safety in which a client may suspend a client. And then of course, if it's the wrong household type, so you could deny someone because they were referred to family shelter, but they don't actually have kids, that kind of thing. Any questions about these sort of shelter access policies? All right, next slide. All right, so emergency shelters in the CoC, with the exception of Durham Crisis Response Center, which basically serves as its own front door just for its own shelter with the domestic violence hotline, are required only to accept clients through the entry point referral process. The exception to this is white flag beds during particularly cold nights or storms. Shelters may temporarily take in someone just to keep them safe. We wanted that process to be as easy as possible because we know a lot of time clients who are higher barrier may show up, and we don't want the process of just getting inside and safe to be overly complicated for them. So referred clients, so if a client's actually referred to shelter, the only reason that shelter should be denying them is they're not eligible homeless status. They were diverted, so they no longer are homeless because they've resolved their homelessness. Again, they're at imminent risk of homelessness in another county, they're a registered sex offender, they have an active suspension from that shelter, or because of their household type. So we went over most of those on the previous slide. Shelters need to follow the shelter suspension policy for making sure that they're only suspending for eligible incidents. The length of the suspension is laid out in that policy and how they report that suspension. So that's all detailed in the coordinated entry policies that are on our website. They go into quite a bit of detail, but this is just an outline here. And then emergency shelters, just like front door providers, are required to participate in the front door providers meeting and population appropriate by nameless meetings. Next slide. Okay. So we recognize that you know, there are places where practice in Durham for permanent housing referrals and prioritization differs from the way the policies are written. So we really didn't want to go into a ton of detail here, but just give some very broad overview of generally how the policy and the practice align. So in order to refer someone for permanent housing, you need to complete a VI SPDAT, an assessment of vulnerability. And ideally, that agency would enter the VI SPDAT into HMIS. Then the referral or the appropriate housing plan is discussed in a by nameless meeting. So right now we have 3, the veterans meeting, the chronic homeless meeting, and the families meeting. That may change, but at the moment, those are the ones we've got. And then once in the by nameless meeting process, that appropriate housing plan is identified, then the agency refers to the identified housing agency. Next slide. So basic eligibility information for our 2 core tenant permanent housing types, rapid rehousing and PSH. So for rapid rehousing, you need to be living in an emergency shelter, on the streets, or in a hotel or motel paid for by a nonprofit or government agency. So people that are at imminent risk of homelessness are not eligible for rapid rehousing. And we prioritize slots for rapid rehousing based on VI SPDAT score, and then ties are broken based on length of time homeless. For permanent supportive housing, it's the same as rapid rehousing, but in addition, they need to be chronically homeless, which means that they've been homeless for 12 months or longer, or they've had 4 or more episodes of homelessness over the last 3 years that total 12 months or more, and they have a documented disability. Any question about eligibility for permanent housing? All right, next slide. Okay, so some basics of being a permanent housing provider. So you must accept referrals from anyone in the CoC. This is really, really important. So if you run a shelter and you run a permanent housing program, you cannot say all of the clients in our permanent housing program have to come from our shelter. You need to have, that's the whole point of coordinated entry. It needs to be an open process, open to the entire community. So regardless of whether that person's staying in your shelter or staying in your transitional housing program, everyone can refer into that permanent housing program. That's really, really important. You should be participating in population appropriate by nameless meetings. So if you run a families permanent housing program, you can participate in families. If you run PSH, you can participate in chronic homeless, those kind of things. You should not be denying eligible client referrals. So of course, if they're not eligible, they're not eligible, but if they are eligible, they shouldn't be denied. And you should follow the prioritization of referrals. So with restrictions of the special populations that you serve, as specified in your funding application. Excuse me. Excuse me. You should be prioritizing based on VI SPDAT score first, and then based on length of time homeless. Any questions about the basic standards for permanent housing providers? Okay, next slide. Ah, yes, we've gotten to the end. Success. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about, really, honestly, we could say coordinate entry, but really anything. We're at the end here, so this is your opportunity. Hey, something we didn't cover, something you didn't ask a little while ago that came up, thoughts, impressions of the overall orientation, just anything you want to share. Should we take that silence to mean no one has any questions or comments? Does anyone have any?
Or they're all asleep.
We've lulled you all into quiet.
Before we adjourn, I think it might be good to invite Ruby, who's a key partner with us, if she's willing, to do a quick orientation to durhamcoc.org for those who who may not have already visited our relatively new website. We opened this new website last fall, I believe, but there may still be, I particularly would want to highlight to people where the CoC grievance policy and grievance form is to make sure clients know where, or staff and clients know where they can access that form.
So the website is durhamcoc.org. This is the front page. with our beautiful skyline. And down here we have some news and alerts that we update on a weekly basis or when things come up. And if you have things that you would like the greater CoC to know, please email me and I can make those updates happen pretty quickly. Right now we have a COVID-19 update webpage with some updates about federal, local, and statewide changes, news, as well as resources from CEF and other agencies. We also have information about entry point changes in this time period, as well as anyone who has questions about COVID-19 and its relation to the CoC or HSAC can submit those questions to our FAQ portal. Here under Get Help, this is where you can find the coordinated entry intake information, and folks can get the up-to-date information as we're in this state with COVID, but I guess once things are relatively back to normal, more information about where to go and locations are here, as well as FAQs about coordinated entry. The client grievance form, the online form is here. You can also access the paper form by clicking on this link, and it'll open up another form that you could print out for your clients. Well, this is the policy. We have, I'll add the actual hard copy form on here. This is the online form that clients can fill out. To get involved is where the majority of information about becoming a CoC member, as well as HSAC board meetings is here. You can become a CoC member here and fill out get the requirements and information we just went over. Conflict of interest statements, as well as the CoC membership form. All of you fill out that form at some point to be on this call. Board meeting information about HSAC board. Here we'll post information about, so this is the April HSAC meeting. We'll post the May information here, as well as agendas and presentations and minutes will be updated soon. Information about standing committees and their current members is located here. Policy and planning, as well as performance management. The public comment form for an HSAC meeting can be found here as well as the excused absence form for members that are HSAC members. If you want to be a CoC liaison, you can complete the form here under becomes a CoC liaison and for the standing committees. The calendar for the CoC is available here as well. We keep most of the meetings, so HSAC executive committee meetings, HSAC meetings will be posted here. Events like the point in time count and other things related to the CoC would be posted here as well. And upcoming events, we have the point in time count, Bull City Fresh Start are posted here. Links to the homeless management information system is here. Policies, all of the policies that were discussed today are located on the website in their entirety. And you can get those links here to download. CoC standards, so coordinated entry policies, data standards. Most of those things we went over today, as well as other policies. The client complaint and grievance policy is here as well. Funding information, information about CoC funding. Okay. Well, there is funding about our CoC policies and applications that should be here, and I need to go look at the links. So give me about a day to go look at that and why it's not coming up. Alrighty, that's it.
Very good. Thank you, Ruby.
And also all of our member organizations and leadership, HSAC leadership and everything is here.
Click on member organizations, please, so people can, well, this is fine too, to show people who's on the HSAC. Then if you, yeah, there we go, member organizations. So for those of you who are organizational members, if you're an organizational member but don't yet have your logo here, please communicate with us to, we'll get you listed as a member organization. I think all of these, I believe all of these logos are links as well to the websites of these organizations.
Yes.
All right.
All right. Any other questions about the
Thank you,
website?
Ruby.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, if you do have questions in the future, please email us. We will be posting these presentations soon. Yes. Lloyd and Hanalea, do you all have anything to add?
No, thank you all for your time and for joining us virtually.
Right. Just a final comment regarding funding. Many of you know that the city has received some supplemental ESG, Emergency Solutions Grant funding for specifically to help address the COVID-19 response. The department is working on getting a brief request for proposals distributed. I'm not sure yet when we're going to be able to distribute that and get it back, but it is going to be hopefully a brief application with also very quick turnaround for actually getting projects approved for funding. The funding amount was substantial relative to our usual entitlement funds, was for over $602,000 of ESG funds. Durham, the entitlement annual funding is typically in about 165,000. So this is almost 4 times as much money. So last week, in consultation with the Policy and Planning Committee and the Homeless Service Provider community in Durham, we did establish that the #1 priority for these funds would be rapid rehousing assistance. Secondly, homeless prevention for people at imminent risk of homelessness. And thirdly, to support our emergency shelters who may be challenged with their budgets due to their response to people experiencing homelessness during the crisis. Thanks. With that, I think we can adjourn. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks for all you do in our community to help us take care of the needs of our homeless sisters and brothers. Take care. Bye-bye.